Aria Mercer stepped out before the household creaked awake, shrugging into a sun-faded pack polished smooth where it rubbed her shoulder over past seasons. The early light was still cool, a pale wash that made the ridge silhouettes look like quiet folded paper. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who has walked into the hills often enough to let worry drain away at the tree line. Her father would later say the morning felt ordinary. Coffee steam, a door hush, then soft gravel crunch fading. By the time the valley's first warm breath lifted the mist, she was already crossing the pale stone apron below the old observatory, an empty dome locals treated like a husk. Tracks behind her thinned as the rock dried. What happened between that slow brightening and the point where all trace softened remains the still center of this story. For months, the mountain held its silence. Nothing obvious, nothing fallen, only patient stone and an unused building watching the sky it no longer measured. Her father returned to the same ridge each weekend with a folded map gone soft at the creases. He walked lines he had walked the week before, speaking her name now and then, not because he expected an answer, but because sound felt like a kind of thread. Volunteers fanned out, scanning gullies and stunted pines where a twisted ankle or loose slab might have ended a day. The story the ground told them was simple. She had come this way, then the thin dust was lifted by wind, and the story stopped. Summer bent toward its quieter edge. The bright green dulled and the nights came earlier. The dome sat slightly above the main path, its panels blotched with weather, a relic people photographed and then left. No one lingered on the idea that inside those walls were layers added long after the public lost interest. Search reports kept returning stamped phrases. No sign, no disturbance, until those words lost weight and became routine. Nearly 10 months later, 2 maintenance workers hiked up under a pale autumn sun to check lightning hardware before heavier storms. The air was thin and dry. Their footsteps clicked on the metal landing. Inside, dust swirled in the light like slow snow. One of them worked a line of reluctant bolts on an inner panel, while the other sorted tools. When the final bolt loosened, the panel shivered and eased forward. A slim, sealed pouch, no thicker than a folded scarf, slid out, tapped the grate, and rested. They paused, expecting perhaps a mouse nest or old wiring, not a carefully protected thing. The pouch was clear enough to show a hand-torn sheet folded with care. Along one edge, faint heat discoloration traced shallow arcs, as though someone had hovered a bright lamp for a breath and pulled away. Inside, a star chart no catalog now prints quite that way, and a phrase pressed in hard block letters near the bottom, not where they looked. Nearly 10 months later, 2 maintenance workers hiked up under a pale autumn sun to check lightning hardware before heavier storms. The air was thin and dry. Their footsteps clicked on the metal landing. Inside, dust swirled in the light like slow snow. One of them worked a line of reluctant bolts on an inner panel, while the other sorted tools. When the final bolt loosened, the panel shivered and eased forward. A slim, sealed pouch, no thicker than a folded scarf, slid out, tapped the grate, and rested. They paused, expecting perhaps a mouse nest or old wiring, not a carefully protected thing. The pouch was clear enough to show a hand-torn sheet folded with care. Along one edge, faint heat discoloration traced shallow arcs, as though someone had hovered a bright lamp for a breath and pulled away. Inside, a star chart no catalog now prints quite that way, and a phrase pressed in hard block letters near the bottom, not where they looked. The finding shifted the air around the case. For so long the search had leaned outward, down ravines, across scree, into thickets. Now attention tilted back toward a man-made shell everyone had treated as background furniture. Questions that had felt closed reopened with a soft crack. Had the pouch been there from the beginning, resting unseen just a hand's span behind metal? Or had someone returned later, using quiet months to tuck it away? The sheet itself felt intentional. The letters cut into its surface left tiny raised rims where the tool had pressed hard. The map lines were deliberate yet slightly out of date, like a melody played in an old key. Her father ran a thumb over a photocopy of the phrase again and again, as if texture alone might release meaning. Among volunteers, a hush settled. Speculation flickered, but many simply felt a gentle inward pull, the sense that the mountain's silence had not been emptiness after all, only a guarded pause. People close to Arya described her small habits, humming the same fragment when lacing boots, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear twice in quick succession when she was deciding something, drawing little spiral fronds in notebook margins. None of those personal marks appeared on the sheet. That absence did not prove another hand had shaped it, but it kept doubt alive. 3 quiet possibilities threaded through evening conversations. Maybe Arya herself, sensing a turn, left a sign where eyes would be slow to wander. Maybe someone forced or guided her to help place it, shaping a future breadcrumb. Or maybe a stranger, months later, planted a crafted lure to stir sleeping interest, bending the search toward puzzles instead of ground. Each path carried a different weight. None yet had roots. What remained solid was the father's steady return to the ridge, the dome's steady weathering, and the chart's steady, patient implication. In the weeks after the pouch appeared, some volunteers tried to solve the chart as if it were a direct set of steps. Others treated it more simply, a quiet nudge saying, "You were looking past something close." The observatory's skin, once just weathered metal, now seemed almost like bark-hiding growth rings. A few people walked slow circles around the dome, palms brushing cold seams, trying to imagine a moment months earlier, a person standing alone with a folded sheet, deciding whether to commit it to the dark. The idea that Arya had found her way inside carried a hint of defiant agency. The idea that someone else had returned later brought a more unsettled chill. Her father did not chase elaborate theories. He taped a copy of the sheet in a plain folder, dated the day beneath it, and spoke softly. "If this is from you, I'm still here. If it is about you, I'm still here." People asked whether Arya would have had reason to enter the dome willingly. The building had long been closed, its remaining equipment stripped or covered. Yet hikers sometimes step through old doors drawn by simple curiosity, a wish to stand where instruments once listened to the sky. If she did, maybe she found an inner layer, a narrow gap behind a panel, and considered it a hiding place for a message no wind would move. But if someone else carried the sheet inside later, they had to know about that hidden space. A casual passerby would be unlikely to unbolt interior metal quietly and then restore it without leaving fresh scuffs. That implied time, patience, and a sense of how long the place went unchecked. These kinds of choices, whether her own or another's, felt slow, deliberate, the opposite of panic. That tone, calm intent, seeped from every careful fold and firm letter. Attention drifted towards softer clues, a smudge where fingers might have pressed, the absence of grit on the pouch exterior suggesting it had not been dragged along open ground. Listeners replayed Arya's last known morning in their minds, smoothing sharp edges, the steady breathing of uphill effort, the quiet shift from forest shade to bare light, the first glimpse of the dome. What could have drawn her nearer? A break in wind, a flicker of curiosity, maybe the simplest desire to look inside a relic before turning back. Her father spoke of her patience, how she'd once spent an entire afternoon persuading a skittish stray dog to drink. That quality made the idea of a self-placed clue feel possible. She might have left something careful rather than hurried. But patience could belong to another hand as well. The chart gave no voice, only posture, composed, centered, waiting. As nights cooled, gatherings shifted to small circles with thermoses, talk kept low out of respect. The chart would rest on a flat stone, everyone leaning just close enough to see. Some tried to trace lines from one marked cluster to another, searching for shapes that meant something. An arrow, a letter, a path. More and more, a quieter frame took hold. Perhaps the sheet was not pointing outward but reflecting the space it was hidden within. A mirror in old language. 3 circled groups echoing 3 features of the dome. If true, the phrase, "not where they looked," could simply be a gentle correction. You were always searching beyond me. Even that reading split gently. Was it her own voice, steady and wry, or a stranger steering eyes inward? With no firm proof either way, people returned to listening. Wind through worn gaps, faint creaks of metal, the ordinary breathing of a structure that kept its secrets without effort. The father's routine became ritual. Each visit he placed a small, smooth stone on a ledge near the door. Not a shrine, just a quiet count of persistence. The pile grew slowly, a modest calendar of presence. Now and then he would unfold the copied sheet and scan the letters as if a new meaning might rise under different light. He had stopped asking, "Why this way?" aloud. Instead, he leaned into simpler, grounding acts. Walking, noticing changes in air, answering kind messages with brief thanks. Some nights he sat facing the dark profile of the ridge from home and let the possibility that the sheet was hers rest beside the fear that it was not. Both feelings could exist without canceling. In that balance, the case, which for months had felt like a vanishing point, regained a soft shape, a set of small human gestures layered against a mountain's patient silence. Whichever hand folded the sheet seemed to understand quiet leverage, how a single object placed just off the center of a fading story could bend the arc without shouting. Nights brought small sounds to the dome, metal ticks as it cooled, a faint sigh where loosened seams met wind. Listeners began to wonder whether the place itself had held more than silence all along. A shadow shifting once when no one moved, a brief scent of cold dust sharper than usual, the sense of being observed by an absence. None of these moments proved anything. They simply shaped a mood that the chart amplified. Her father, pausing outside, sometimes felt as though he was arriving after a conversation had ended, missing only the last turn of phrase. The pouch's former resting space, now empty and ordinary, became a stage you could almost project a figure into. Someone standing there months earlier, deciding what to leave and what not to. A few volunteers suggested the phrase might hide another layer, initial letters, counted gaps. Yet each attempt collapsed back into plain reading, as if the sheet politely resisted cleverness. That refusal added a thin second skin of mystery. Deliberate restraint can be its own signal. If an outsider planted it, why not flaunt certainty? An arrow, a claim, a signature. Holding back felt almost intimate, like a message left for a listener expected to understand tone more than code. Some evenings the father would trace the margin scorch marks, if that is what they were, with a fingertip just above the paper, as though heat lingered there in memory. He confessed once that he sometimes answered the phrase under his breath. "We're looking here now." The words never changed, yet they kept inviting quiet replies, knitting a conversation whose other participant remained undefined. Mist pooled low one dawn, and in that blunted light the dome lost hard edges, becoming a dim lantern shape. A volunteer standing near the entrance said she felt a pressure to speak softly, though no one inside slept. That hush seemed to collect around the notion of timing. Why that month? Not earlier, not later. If Arya had left it herself, the delay meant discovery hid behind simple chance, a panel finally disturbed. If another hand placed it later, they chose a lull when the story had thinned but not died. That choice suggests watchfulness, someone tracking the rhythm of fading interest, sliding the sheet into its pocket just before attention fell too low to spark again. Intent that patient feels personal, yet personal to whom? The absence of any second object, a scrap of fabric, a familiar doodle, felt like a deliberate narrowing. Focus only here, no comforting anchor, just this measured hint. As autumn deepened, small things gained weight. A beam of late sun catching dust where the pouch once lay, a draft curling around boot tops near the panel seam as if mapping a path upward. People started sharing small maybe moments. A soft tap behind metal when no one touched it, a brief impression of warmth by the door. Each account was careful, offered without insistence, building a folklore of attentive noticing rather than spectacle. The mystery did not swell into wild theories. It sank inward, quietly saturating the space so that ordinary details, bolt heads, paint blisters, faint old labels, felt charged. The star clusters on the sheet echoed this. Familiar forms gently misaligned, recognizable yet slightly off, the way a remembered voice in a dream sounds both right and not. That gentle dissonance kept listeners leaning forward, patient, open to a next sign whose shape none could name. The father began leaving a small strip of clean cloth on a ledge inside the outer doorway, returning next visit to see if dust patterns changed. Nothing shifted, yet the act felt like holding a place in line for an unseen response. He spoke less. The ridge gave back only wind and the occasional hawk's thin call. Still, a sense grew that the story had entered a waiting corridor, narrow, quiet, not empty. The chart, protected and precise, functioned almost like a lighthouse with its lamp hushed, presence without beam, structure inviting interpretation, but withholding direction. Some nights people imagined Arya herself choosing that restraint, deciding her best chance to be recognized lay in prompting patience rather than chase. Others pictured an unknown caretaker of narrative, someone unwilling to let her name slip fully into static lists. Between these soft theories, the mystery breathed, unresolved yet tended, a steady ember refusing both extinction and easy flare. 3 gentle story paths remained in common talk. One pictured Arya feeling a turning in the air that morning, some inner barometer warning of drift, and choosing to leave a trace where wind and rain could not thin it. Another imagined a second presence, not loud or rushed, guiding or observing, shaping a relic to steer future eyes inward rather than farther out. The third saw a later visitor, quiet and persistent, returning after public heat cooled, crafting a careful diversion or memorial. None of these paths demanded dramatic struggle. Each relied on patience, familiarity with the hill, and a sense of timing. Listeners rotated among them the way someone turns a smooth stone in a pocket. No single face locked into truth. The chart's restraint supported all 3. Its calm lettering, lack of flourish, and single plain phrase opened doorways without closing others, sustaining a balance that felt intentional. When fog thinned one evening, a pale glow held around the dome before full dark settled. A volunteer said it looked like a breath that had chosen not to leave. Such remarks were offered with a shy smile, not as evidence, but they fed the hush cordoning off the site. People rarely speculated about motives in grand terms anymore. Instead, they traced modest practicalities. A person would need a moment of privacy, knowledge of a hidden lip behind a panel, materials gathered calmly. No sign suggested frantic scraping or forced hinges. The act, whoever performed it, seemed almost courteous to the space. That civility made darker readings feel less at home, though they did not vanish. Quiet, thoughtful placement can mask many intentions. The father listened to these reflections, sometimes nodding, sometimes simply letting the sounds braid with evening insects until only a soft pulse of presence remained. Approaching winter reframed urgency. Snow would soon mute surface hints further and narrow visits. The chart needed nothing. Sealed and shielded, it could have waited longer. That fact alone lent it a patient voice. It chose, in a sense, to emerge when it did, by design or chance. Some evenings, a small group would practice steady observation, standing still, eyes adjusting, attending to layers, outer door, interior air, panel seam, the hollow where the pouch once rested. This simple exercise calmed restless minds that earlier months had filled with tangled logic ladders. In that slowed state, the absence of a second object began to speak louder. If this were a showy plant, why not add a token? If self-made, why only one phrase? The restraint, again, leaned toward someone understanding that a single clear note can carry farther at night than a chord of competing signals. Stories from other long searches drifted in, a ribbon found years later in brush, a bootprint preserved under overhang, a note in a dry cave. Each tale underscored how delayed findings reshape hope without always solving loss. Listeners placed Arya's chart among these, not a loud revelation, but a quiet reorientation. Her father, aware of how speculation can fray families, gently steered conversations back to grounded acts, checking updated maps, logging weather shifts, noting minor path erosion. This soft discipline created a kind of circle around the mystery, keeping it warm without letting it flare wild. Within that circle, new voices, people who had not known Arya, spoke of her as if present through the steady care her name summoned. The unhurried tone of these exchanges suggested the chart's main work might be relational, binding strangers into a patient vigil rather than pointing a direct finger. One evening, thin rain tapped the dome and ran in slow silver threads. The father stood under the eave, listening, eyes on the seam where the panel had once hidden its passenger. He said softly that the hardest part was not the absence of answers, but the shifting between seeing the chart as her hand and seeing it as a crafted echo. Holding both required gentle muscles he was still building. Around him, small lamps made islands of warm color in the mist. A volunteer read the phrase again as though tone alone might change its contour. Not where they looked. It felt less like rebuke now, more like a measured suggestion to widen or turn the gaze. In that invitation, fragile but persistent, the long quiet of the ridge gained a direction, not a clear path, but a willingness to keep adjusting perspective without surrendering to noise. Rain polished the path one afternoon, darkening the stone so the dome's dull panels reflected a faint, wavering sheen. A small group walked slow arcs, letting the quiet resettle after each footfall. Conversation drifted toward how easily a single object can take root in collective thought. Before the pouch, the story was distance and absence. After it, attention drew inward like breath. Someone observed that nothing else had appeared. No second sheet, no clarifying token, as if whoever left the chart understood that adding more might dull its edge. The restraint itself became part of the mystery's posture. Precise, patient, almost courteous. Her father traced the line where metal meets frame, feeling only cool firmness, yet he said it helped to imagine an earlier pair of hands pausing here, deciding this was enough. That imagined pause served like a bridge between what they knew and what remained behind a soft veil. A gust threaded through warped seams and set a thin tremor through a loose ladder rung. Everyone fell still, listening, hopeful the space might give up a new detail. It did not. The quiet settled back, deeper for having been briefly disturbed. They spoke then about misdirection, not with suspicion, more with gentle caution. A planted object can steer months of energy if people chase flourish over substance. Yet nothing about the chart felt gaudy. Its plain phrase did not shout for attention. It invited a slow, inward lean. If it was misdirection, it was crafted by someone who understood patience as a tool. If it was Arya's, maybe that same patience had been part of her plan. A clue that would age quietly until the right small act of maintenance opened its narrow door. Either reading left them in the same place, watchful, steady, unwilling to flood the silence with noise. Night visits became less about searching and more about keeping a respectful watch. A red lamp here, a thermos there, subdued shapes near the entrance. Stories shared were soft, anchoring aria in everyday textures. How she favored a worn gray beanie. How she once mended a frayed pack strap with small, even stitches. These images offset the abstract pull of the chart, keeping the person ahead of the puzzle. Someone suggested writing their own message and sealing it in a new pouch. The idea was gently set aside. Layering more artifacts risked turning a quiet hinge into clutter. The single sheet's strength lay in how it framed the space without filling it. Her father at times simply leaned against the outer wall, eyes closed, matching his breathing to the hill's calm rhythm, as if letting the environment reacquaint itself with the patience it would need to reveal anything further. First, thin snow dusted the ridge and melted by midday, leaving a damp outline along panel seams. Moisture traced the contour where the pouch had rested, like a watermark teasing shape out of plain metal. A volunteer remarked that if the chart had waited any longer, winter might have sealed it away until another cycle, a different year, a different cast of helpers, a different level of hope. The timing, then, continued to whisper of intention, not dramatic, simply well chosen. Her father turned the sheet copy under softer light and noticed how the ink, or whatever tool pressed those lines, held consistent darkness, unfaded by exposure. Protected time inside the panel had kept it from bleaching. Preservation became part of the narrative. Whoever set it there seemed to care that it would arrive intact. Care implied closeness, whether emotional or simply meticulous. Both kept the act lodged in the realm of human, not random. As the year leaned toward full cold, a natural pause approached. Trails would ice, visits would thin. Plans formed to secure the area lightly without turning it into a fenced relic. The father agreed on the condition the place remain approachable. A breathing story, not a sealed exhibit. He wrote a short note, not left on site but kept folded in his pocket, addressed to no one by name. Gratitude for the chart. Plea for more if more existed. Promise of continued listening either way. That private letter served the same function for him as the stone pile, a simple structure to hold perseverance. Around him, others spoke of returning after snowmelt, of reading winter weather patterns for clues about airflow that could have carried scent or sound months earlier. Even future quiet had a plan. The mystery, still unsolved, had settled into a maintained ember, small, steady, and deliberately shielded from both extinction and reckless gusts. Winter's first persistent crust finally held on a shaded slope, faintly crunching under careful boots. Fewer people made the climb now. Those who did moved slower, as if matching their pace to the narrowed daylight. Attention turned inward in another way, revisiting early assumptions with fresh gentleness. Had the initial search leaned too hard toward a simple fall? Could a quiet entrant have guided her, willingly or not, toward the dome? Without new artifacts, those questions remained soft outlines. Yet the chart's single phrase continued working like a lens, bending thought just enough to keep complacency away. Her father said he no longer waited for a dramatic reveal. He waited for alignment, a small new piece, a second understated note that would either echo the first tone or set it in clearer contrast. Patience, once a coping tool, had matured into a method. In the hush of deepening cold, the dome's ordinary noises, metal cooling clicks, a faint thread of wind, grew more distinct. Listeners described a sense of almost hearing a second layer beneath them, like a soft harmony just out of range. It was human tendency, they knew, to weave meaning into random creaks, yet acknowledging that did not fully dim the impression. The chart's restraint had trained everyone to treat subtlety as potentially meaningful. A pair of new volunteers, having read condensed notes online, were struck by how little wasn't there. No wild spray of theories taped to walls, no markers sketching elaborate conjectures, just a maintained quiet, curated by loss and respect. That absence of clutter itself felt like a decision shaped by the values of those who continued coming. The mystery lived not only in what happened months ago, but in this present choreography of careful attention. One clear night, a meteor traced a brief silver thread above the ridge. A few people saw it and let out the smallest breath of shared awe. The father later said it felt like a reminder that transient flashes can exist alongside long stillness without explaining it away. The star shapes on the sheet, slightly misaligned echoes of known patterns, mirrored that idea. Imperfect reflections, neither empty nonsense nor precise map. They held just enough familiarity to resist dismissal. Some began framing the chart not as a puzzle to solve, but as a posture to adopt, focused, pared down, exact without elaboration. In that frame, the act of continued presence, visits, quiet maintenance, gentle storytelling, became the real signal outward, a steady beam inviting any silent witness to step forward, or any withheld piece to drift free when time finally tilts right. As plans formed for spring, fresh airflow tests, a careful reinspection of interior cavities with a softer touch, the father composed a public note for those who followed from afar. He thanked people for resisting the urge to adorn the site with symbolic objects, emphasizing that the space's uncluttered state honored both known and unknown hands. He invited listeners not to chase intricate secret codes, but to hold attention open in a way that allows small, verifiable changes to register. If anyone possessed knowledge about that folded chart, he asked they consider that a single quiet addendum, dated, plain, compassionate, would carry more weight than any dramatic claim. The message traveled gently through forums, and most responses mirrored the tone, steady, respectful, unhungry for spectacle. The community had, by slow practice, tuned itself to the same minimal key as the sheet. Near the year's turn, a final thin visit before storms closed easy access brought a handful of familiar faces. They stood a while in companionable silence. One volunteer read the phrase aloud, not for the 100th time, but as a way of marking continuity, not where they looked. It now sounded less like a riddle than a soft instruction about attention's geometry. That searching is also a matter of angle and depth, not only radius. Her father placed a new small stone, brushed snow from the ledge, and said nothing further. The group let the quiet fill back in around their presence. Leaving, they glanced once more at the seam, now simply part of the wall again. The absence of any new clue did not ring as failure. The held field of care remained intact, an invisible framework awaiting whatever slow truth might one day negotiate its way to the surface. In the weeks that followed, updates to the outside world became simpler. No new artifact, ongoing quiet review of earlier material, continued visits spaced by weather. The narrative plateaued in a way some might call unresolved, yet inside that plateau a careful refinement had happened. The story was no longer only a vanishing and a found object. It had become a practice, a model of how to hold an unanswered question without distorting it. People who had joined late carried the tone forward, summarizing for others with care rather than drama. The chart, still singular, had achieved something paradoxical. By refusing to explain itself fully, it kept attention from collapsing into either disbelief or ungrounded myth. That middle space, though fragile, sustained constructive empathy longer than a sensational reveal might have. The father quietly marked the passing weeks on a home calendar, a parallel ledger to the growing pile of ridge stones. If a final answer waits, buried, withheld, or simply subtle, it may surface in its own unhurried season. Until then, the dome remains a quiet companion, its metal aging grain by grain, its seams breathing shallowly with temperature shifts. The folded chart, copied and stored, continues to do its modest work, reminding anyone who listens that where you search shapes what you find, and that patience can be both shield and instrument. Arya's name, spoken steadily rather than shouted, threads through this landscape like a low, continuous note. For those hearing this now, the invitation is gentle. Remember her, Hold space for small, verifiable signs. Resist the tug toward noise. Sometimes a mystery's most honest form is not a race to closure, but a shared agreement to keep a lamp trimmed for as long as it takes. In that dedicated watchfulness, absence does not vanish. It is witnessed, softly, faithfully, and without letting go. Late winter loosens unevenly. South slopes show wet freckles, while the band below the dome still holds thin plates of ice that lift and click in weak sun. Her father walks the melt boundary without chasing revelation, just learning new trickle lines, patches of pressed needles springing back. Each tiny shift affirms the hill kept breathing, while answers stayed quiet. In his pocketbook he notes, "Surface breath returning." His pages no longer press for meaning. They catalog companionship, ridge weather, light angles, ordinary change. The chart did not freeze the place. It only taught a different pace for looking. Sometimes he sets the photocopy on a flat stone and lets dusk glide across the calm phrase. He no longer traces letters. Instead, he watches a slight lifted fiber near one margin, familiar now like a landmark. That small intimacy shows how an object can settle without losing weight. People notice they are slower with other unresolved things elsewhere. Fewer rushed theories, more permission to say, "We don't know," as a finished line. In quiet talk, someone calls the chart a tiny manual for ethical attention. No one writes that down. Yet the idea folds itself into the group's unspoken method. The practice persists. Measured visits, a name spoken plainly, departure without scraping for drama. At a distance, participation can be as simple as reserving a mental clearing where unfinished matters rest, neither hardened into certainty nor abandoned. The phrase lingers not as directive, but calibration. Widen, soften, hold. Should another small piece belong, it will arrive in its own season. If not, care given here is not wasted. It diffuses into how listeners approach the next quiet gap they meet. In that diffusion, absence is neither glamorized nor dismissed. It is witnessed, patiently, without letting go. A mild thaw wind threads the fir tips and drops a few bark flecks near the door. Quiet punctuation. A volunteer kneels, not to collect them as trace, only to notice how shed pieces join the slow ledger of place. Someone says impatience in other cases breeds loud reenactments. Here the absence of drama is the point. The father notes that a rushed story could crowd the gentle path any real detail still needs. He writes, "Calm protects contour." It's a reminder that pressure blurs edges the chart preserved. They leave before light fully drains, resisting the urge to stretch twilight. Timely departure has become its own quiet discipline. Before sunrise, frost paints brief fern patterns across a thin film on the panel, then lifts as pale light washes in. The father watches the temporary script vanish, thinking how many small, unrecorded signatures the metal hosts and releases. He speaks the phrase once, not pleading, just tuning attention. Far away, listeners picture the same ridge, a shared mental landscape. Sparse, cool, patient. That diffuse attention forms a soft field over the unanswered center, neither sealing nor tearing it open. If a second modest object ever surfaces, it will meet a community trained to greet it without distortion. Until then, the practice loops gently. Observe, note, refrain, release. Stability as subtle forward motion.